Hey guys, welcome to Intel vs AMD Season 2, Episode 2. In the previous episode, we checked out the Athlon Thunderbird 1000C and 1200C and saw how they outperformed the Intel Pentium 4 running at 1.4 and 1.6 GHz. With the Pentium 4, Intel made a very controversial move and teamed up with RAM bus. So the early Pentium 4 machines all used RDRAM, which is very fast, but also it was very expensive. Eventually DDR memory would come to the Pentium 4, and we will of course check this out in future episodes. But today we're looking at the Intel 845 chipset, which brought the cheap but also slow SDR SDRAM memory to the Pentium 4. I believe Intel wanted to achieve two things by going with SDR memory. They wanted to keep going with RDRAM for the mainstream and high-end systems, but with SDR memory, they wanted to offer cheap systems that would sound attractive with high numbers because of the higher clock speed that the Pentium 4 runs at. But also because SDR memory was cheap, so large amounts of RAM could be sold in cheap computers. Here we have an example of such a machine. This is the Aldi PC from November of 2001, how it was sold in Germany. At first, the specs sound impressive. We have a Pentium 4 running at 1.8 GHz, 256 MB of RAM, and a GeForce 3. But looking closer, we find that the processor has the slower Willamette core. The memory is not only SDR memory, but is the slower CL3 type, and the video card is the slowest GeForce 3, the TI-200. But regardless, the Pentium 4 sold in masses despite Athlon systems offering better value. Much of this is because of Intel's marketing campaigns, but also because of unethical business practices, which eventually led to a settlement of over $1 billion that Intel had to pay to AMD. Now, I did a ton of benchmarking for this video. We will see how the Pentium 4 compares with RDRAM and SDR memory against the AMD Athlon. But really in this video, the Pentium 4 is competing against itself. So we will take a look at CPU scaling with the two different memory types. How much of an impact do memory timings have? Does RDRAM consume more power? And what happens if you're stuck with PC100 memory? And then we will install Windows XP and Steam and check out a few more modern games to see how good or how bad they run on a Pentium 4 with SDR memory. So let's take a look at the motherboard that we're using for the Pentium 4 with the SDR memory. It is the Asus P4B, and that was a popular representative back in the day. I had a look at some time period reviews of this era, and yeah, it's a great little board. We've got the Intel 845 chipset, AGP4X, we've got PCI slots. Once again, it uses the Intel hub architecture with the memory controller hub here, connecting to all the fast stuff like AGP, the memory and the processor. And this is the ICH2, which is the input-output controller hub. Both are connected with a 266 megabytes per second bus. And the Intel controller hub 2 connects to all the slow stuff, the PCI bus, ID, USB, floppy, and so on. Couple of interesting things about the board. Firstly, if you don't have an ATX compatible power supply with the 4-pin connector, you could use just a standard Molex adapter. So that was quite interesting and just made it easier for people to upgrade. And another really cool feature about this motherboard is the post reporter, which basically, instead of outputting error codes when posting, it has digital speech, and I captured that through the line output. Let's have a look at some of these examples.
System failed memory test. System completed power on self-test. Computer now booting from operating system. No IDE hard disk detected. System failed VGA test.
So that's a pretty cool feature. After a while it does get annoying, but when you're first putting together the system and you're running into some issues, this is actually really helpful. So it's something I would use in the beginning when building the machine, and once everything is working, I would likely just turn it off. And in terms of BIOS settings, I use the BIOS defaults. The faster 3 to 4 memory divider was selected, so the SDR memory runs at 133 MHz. There was also an option to manually dial in the memory timing, so I did that. We're running with the fastest memory timings, 2225, and there was also a Turbo 2 option which I enabled, and the board gave me excellent stability, so very happy with this system. And here we have the system representing the RDRAM results. It's an Intel motherboard, micro ADX, a little bit smaller. We have the memory controller hub 850 up here, connected to a 266 megabytes per second bus to the ICH2. Once again, we've got AGP4X PCI slots. We have ATA400 RD interfaces. There are USB ports, floppy interface, and all in all, this is a really well-working motherboard. For the memory, we have two RDRAM sticks. These are from Samsung, PC800 with 45 nanoseconds, and you have to install these in pairs and also install these terminator modules into the empty slots. In terms of BIOS settings, there's really nothing you can tweak. It's an Intel board, so all the performance stuff is basically locked out. So I'll load the BIOS defaults. I do turn off some resources like parallel or serial ports, onboard sound, onboard Ethernet. I turn off any of that stuff. But yeah, there are no performance improvement options in the BIOS at all. So we just have what Intel gave us in terms of stock performance. And this is the motherboard we're using to represent the socket A CPUs. It's from Asus, A7V266-E, uses the VIA KT266A North bridge, and here we've got the South bridge. These two are connected with what VIA calls VLink, also running at 266 megabytes per second. We have AGP4X PCI, we have ATA400 RD controllers, floppy USB, all the standard stuff. And this motherboard uses DDR, so we're using a 512 megabyte DDR400 memory module. Now the memory divider I configured is 1-to-1, so it also runs at 266, and this lets us use the fastest memory timings. There's also a BIOS option to set the command rate to 1T, and there's another BIOS option, some sort of a turbo mode. So I turned all that on, and stability is excellent. And yeah, very fast motherboard and a good representation to show what these fast Athlon Thunderbird CPUs can do. Because a lot of what we're looking at today has to do with memory, let's talk about some of the terms and what they mean. RAM stands for Random Access Memory, meaning any part of the memory can be accessed randomly without delay. This is in contrast to sequential memory like magnetic tape storage. You couldn't randomly access the beginning and the end of a tape, but you had to forward and rewind, which was a slow process. DRAM stands for Dynamic RAM and uses capacitors to store information, which are ones and zeros. For a 1, the capacitor holds a charge, but they lose this charge over time, so they have to be constantly refreshed. We can compare this to SRAM, which is static RAM, and a good example are case chips on something like this 486 motherboard. Static RAM don't use capacitors and they don't need to be recharged over time. And finally, SDRAM, the S meaning synchronized. SDRAM is synchronized with the clock, running at multiples of the clock, which is called the memory divider. On the SDRAM Pentium 4 we're using today, the clock is running at 100 MHz and the memory can run at either 100 MHz by using the 1-to-1 memory divider or 133 MHz by using the 3-to-4 memory divider. On the Athlon system we're using DDR SDRAM, DDR standing for double data rate. So during every clock cycle, double the data can be transferred. So at 133 MHz, this will give us an effective memory clock speed of 266 MHz. Sometimes to clarify which memory is used, the term SDR SDRAM is used, which stands for single data rate SDRAM, in contrast to double data rate SDRAM. And because pretty much all memory used in computers is SDRAM, many just use the terms SDR, DDR, DDR2, DDR3, DDR4, but the bottom line is that all of these memory types are SDRAM. Both SDR and DDR have a 64-bit memory interface, so we can easily work out the transfer rates. For PC100 memory, we're getting 800 megabytes per second. PC133 memory ups it to around 1067 megabytes per second. And DDR266 memory, we're getting 2133 megabytes per second. And finally, the second Pentium 4 system we're using today uses RDRAM, which stands for RAM bus DRAM. This type of memory runs at 400 MHz and uses double data rate, so they have an effective memory clock speed of a massive 800 MHz. On top of that, 2 memory modules are used in dual channel configuration, doubling the transfer rate once more and giving us a final transfer rate of 3200 megabytes per second. Now this is triple compared to the PC133 SDR memory, and obviously this is going to affect the performance of the Pentium 4. By just how much? Well, we're going to look at this right now after taking a look at our test system. So let's have a look at the system that we're using to get all the Windows 98 benchmark results. The motherboard, the Asus P4B. We got our GeForce 2 GTS with 64 megabytes of RAM. We have a stick from Crucial, 256 megabyte of SDR memory, and very fast timings, CL2. So I went into the BIOS, made sure the lowest timings are set, and there's also a turbo option. I turned that on as well. We have a 500 watt fully modular power supply from Deepcool. I've been using this in all the tests to make sure that all the power draw measurements are reliable and comparable. And unfortunately, the Promise SATA controller that I usually use, it just wouldn't work in this machine. The controller would pick up the hard drive, but it just would not boot from it. So plan B, a SATA to ID adapter, and we're using an 80 gigabyte Western Digital SATA hard drive and also an optical drive to install Windows. So let's take a look at the results. The blue bars are for Intel, the green ones and the top are from the Athlon system. The bottom 2 bars, these use RDRAM. You can see the labels on the left side, and the middle 2 bars, these use SDR memory. So we can clearly see that the Athlon is faster than both, and that the SDR memory is lagging behind the Pentium 4 with RDRAM. In Draken we can see the same thing, the Athlon in front, followed by the Pentium 4 with RDRAM, and then the Pentium 4 with SDR memory. Here we have Quake 2 running in software render. We can see the exact same thing. Let's move on to Quake 2 with OpenGL render. Also the same thing, we're just getting a lot higher performance. So this game runs really fast on any of these processors. Next we've got Quake 3. Now this is a game that runs really well on the Pentium 4, and the Pentium 4 with RDRAM is taking the lead. But once again, the Athlon is extremely competitive. It's not far behind the Pentium 4 with RDRAM, and it's definitely faster than the Pentium 4 with SDR memory. Here we have MDK2, and everything is back to usual. The Athlon in front of all the Pentium 4s. The next game we have is SDR. Here nothing changes. And the last game we're looking at is Unreal Tournament, and we can see once again nothing is new. The Athlon is the fastest gaming processor here, and followed by the RDRAM Pentium 4, and then at the rear the Pentium 4 system with SDR memory. So next I wanted to have a look at CPU scaling, and we're using the Pentium 4 processors with the Willamette core. So we have a clock speed range from 1.4 to 1.6 to 1.8 to 2 gigahertz, and you can see the blue line is the system with RDRAM, and the orange line is the one with SDR memory. And we can see a couple of things. We can see firstly there's a performance difference, of course, but we can also see that the higher the clock speed, the more difference between the two memory technologies. That's visible in Expandable. We can see the same thing in Draken. We can see the same thing in Quake 3. Here the gap is larger, so this game seems to be more dependent on the memory performance. And another game, SDR, also quite a large difference. And once again, we can see the higher the clock speed, the bigger the difference between the two memory technologies. There was one more thing I wanted to look at, and that was the memory timings with SDR memory. So I swapped the fast CL2 memory for a slower brand with CL3 memory. I only did one test run at 2 gigahertz, so that's that little triangle on the far right. So it's a little bit below the CL2 result. Moving on to Draken, same thing, it's just a few FPS behind. In Quake 3, the gap is larger. We are now talking 11 FPS difference, and in SDR also a difference. So the bottom line is there is a difference between CL2 and CL3 memory. So if you have CL2 memory lying around, definitely go with that. If you're shopping around for SDR memory, do pick the CL2, it's always better to have the faster memory option, but as we can see in the result, the difference is not that great. Now there's more. I wanted to look at what happens if you install PC100 memory. So that means going into the BIOS and overriding the default memory divider and selecting 1 to 1, and we can see the performance is now really plummeting. So it's the bottom blue line, and yeah, performance is a lot lower in expandable. We can see the same thing in Draken, but what really stands out is that we don't get any CPU scaling almost. It's basically a horizontal line, and it gets worse in Quake 3. 79, 78, 79, 78 FPS, so there is basically no improvement with clock speed, which is really shocking. So that just shows how much the Pentium 4 is reliant on fast memory. And we can see the same thing in Series SAM with PC100 memory, almost no improvement with clock speed. But if you give it just a little bit more memory with the PC133, we can still see some CPU scaling going on. So let's have a look at some power draw results, and this is a really interesting graph. We can see a couple of cool things here. Firstly, the measurements are taken at the wall. The entire system is measured, but excluding any peripherals like monitor. We can see that the RDRAM system draws more power. Now, firstly, it has 2 sticks of RAM, so that is worth keeping in mind, but the capacity is the same. We can see a delta of around 12 watts, so that's quite interesting. And once again, we can see that the Athlon system consumes more power even at idle. But I need to look a little bit more into that, because remember a while ago we reviewed a Fujitsu Siemens OEM motherboard that Gigabyte produced, and that is my only Athlon motherboard that shows similar power draw around 60 watts under idle. All the other Athlon motherboards show around 90 watts, so there's something weird going on. Now this is under Windows 98. I haven't looked into Windows XP, and I always configure the same options for the power settings. I set it to always on, and I turn off any power down options. The next graph, this is playing Quake 2 in software mode at 640 by 480. Once again, we can see that the SDR memory system draws less power, and the Pentium 4 systems in general now drawing more power than it did under idle, but the Athlon system still consumes more power than the equivalent Pentium 4 counterparts. And we stay in Quake 2, but now we're switching to OpenGL, putting some load on the video card at 1600 by 1200. All the results across the board go up, but nothing changes. Athlon consumes most of the power, followed by the RDRAM Pentium 4, and then the SDR memory system on the Pentium 4 consumes the least power. So next we're gonna install Windows XP Service Pack 3 with Steam and a couple of games, just to see how this machine handles some of the newer games. So I've done a few upgrades. We now got a Radeon HD 3650 AGP video card. We've got a USB 2.0 PCI card with an NEC controller. We also have a wireless 802.11 AC adapter to connect to the network. We've got a Sound Blaster, that's an Audio G2 ZS, including a bracket with optical audio out, which makes my life a little bit easier for capturing. For Windows XP, you definitely want to go with more RAM. Unfortunately, I only had 2 sticks of 512 megabyte of SDR sticks. There exist 1 gigabyte sticks, but I don't have any, so that's maybe something I need to look into getting. Also, the memory timings of these modules not as fast. I'll put them on the screen, slightly slower, but a gig of RAM should do the job just fine for Windows XP. We're still using the SATA to ID adapter, but I did swap out the hard drive for a Western Digital Blue with 160 gigabytes, and that might make a difference in Windows XP because the hard drive is a little bit more modern and faster. So we're trying out kind of the same games we had a look at the previous episode. So first up is Doom 3. We're running at 1024 by 768 with medium details and EAX sound enabled. And yes, this game struggles quite a bit, definitely not enjoyable. Now we will later swap out the video card for a GeForce, so we will see if maybe the Radeon card is holding back the system here. Next up we've got Far Cry, also running at 1024 by 768 with medium details. That game seems to run okay. There are a few hiccups, but the game renders correctly. Indoors we're getting higher FPS. Outdoors the FPS do go down a little bit. Then we have Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb. A couple of you mentioned that there's a config file, and so I had a quick look, and yep, it's a simple edit to uncap the frame rate, so we are now uncapped. You can see the performance. It runs fine, but we're getting dips below 30 FPS, which I didn't see on the Athlon that we had a look at recently. Now, the other game I tried was Half-Life 2. Now, this is the current Steam version, so it's a lot more demanding than the version you got back in the day. Also running at 1024x768 with medium details. Just for note, Emperor's Doom was running at 1024x768 as well, fully maxed out. Half-Life 2 with medium details. And yeah, it does run okay, but also struggles a little bit. So what I did next was I swapped out the Radeon for a GeForce. It's a 6600 GT. Now, the reason I did that is because I've been reading a lot that the Radeon cards have a bit of a higher CPU overhead, and especially on a CPU limited system like this one, you want to use a graphics card that has a lower CPU overhead. So let's have a look at Doom 3, and I'll try to put the footage side by side, and we can see clearly that the game runs a lot better on the GeForce. At times it seems it's running twice as fast. So that's yeah, if you want to play Doom 3, then it seems a GeForce is the way to go if you're building a retro PC. The other game we tried was Far Cry, also side by side, but it's a bit hard to sync up the gameplay. I didn't take the same route, to be honest. Now, that game seems to run just as average on the GeForce. I couldn't really see a difference. However, on the Radeon, the game renders correctly. On the GeForce, if you continue a little bit, we're getting texture errors, render errors, so that has to do with the driver version. A older driver is necessary to make Far Cry run without any flaws. So to summarize the Windows XP Service Pack 3 experience on the Pentium 3 with SDR memory, the whole experience was quite sluggish. So just booting the machine, installing games, using it, and yeah, very sluggish. Now, this time we're using a better hard drive than we did in the previous video, so I don't believe it's to do with storage. Most of the time the CPU load is 100% and it's just waiting for the processor. Once you're in a game, it's not too bad, but loading times between levels and loading times to get into the game are also quite average, and we saw that in newer games, even with the GeForce card, they are just too demanding. So very similar recommendation than we had in the last video with the Athlon. So with the Pentium 4 with SDR memory, stick with Windows 98. It will run pretty much all Windows 98 games really well, and you might want to stick to early era Windows XP games, but anything that's a few years more modern than the system itself will definitely be a struggle. I think it's time to wrap up this video with a summary. So clearly the RDRAM system is faster, but to be honest, reading stuff on the internet, I did expect a lot worse from SDR memory on the Pentium 4. Maybe this is another case of comparing a really fast motherboard from ASUS, which has performance options enabled in the BIOS, with a comparatively conservative Intel system. But this is always something that you need to keep in mind with these benchmarks. It's almost always impossible to isolate just one component. In the end, we're really comparing two systems with each other. I'm trying to get another RAM bus motherboard very soon, but this might take a while, and yeah, it depends on what's available and the prices, of course. In terms of working with these motherboards, the SDR memory Pentium 4 board was rock stable and works great with Windows 98. However, there was one issue that was unfortunate, and that was it wouldn't work with the Promise SATA controller. This is really my only motherboard where I ran into this weird issue, but look, I just switched to the SATA to ID converter instead, and that worked just fine. It is also amazing how Intel got away with everything. AMD having a higher IPC was a massive achievement, but back in the day the concept might have been too new and people just compared the clock speed, and the Pentium 4 with the higher clock speeds was an easy sell despite the Athlon offering better performance and value. So there you have it, guys. When you're matching the Pentium 4 with cheap SDR memory, you're gonna lose performance compared to the RDRAM platform, but I was surprised the difference was not that great. I expected a lot worse. Now, if you're looking for a Pentium 4 system to build a retro gaming PC, you're really spoiled for choice. There's a ton of stuff on eBay, for example. Prices are still reasonably cheap, so very likely you're just going to end up with a system that uses DDR memory, and we will have a look at that in future videos. Let me know, what do you think about SDR memory on the Pentium 4? Maybe you had such a system, or maybe you were clever enough to inform yourself with reviews and you either got the RAM bus system or you went with the socket A. Do tell your story down below in the comments. I'm always eager to hear from you. And that's it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you soon with another one.